Welcome back, Deep Divers. Today, we're going to travel back in time to 1874 to explore the world of Franz Brentano and his groundbreaking work, Psychology from an Empirical Standpoint.
Oh, an excellent choice.
So we'll be diving into excerpts from the preface.
Yeah.
And the first two books, really unpacking Brentano's ideas about how we study the mind, what mental phenomena really are, and even tackling the big question of unconscious mental activity.
You know, it's really fascinating to think about the context of this book. 1874 was a time when psychology was really trying to find its footing as a science, moving away from purely philosophical approaches. And Brentano was right in the thick of that movement.
Yeah, you could definitely feel that tension in his writing.
Mm-hmm.
He's so committed to rigorous empirical study, but he also doesn't shy away from the philosophical implications of his work.
Oh, absolutely.
In fact, he's quite bold in the preface,
Yeah.
declaring his intention to, quote, refute and discard any opinions he finds erroneous.
He even takes on some major figures of his time, folks like Mill, Bain, and Helmholtz. But as he says, it's all in pursuit of the truth.
Yeah. So let's dive into this idea of psychology as an empirical science. Brentano really emphasizes inner perception as the core of psychological data.
Right.
But he's very careful to distinguish it from introspection.
Yes.
What's the difference there, and why does it matter so much to him?
Well, that's a key distinction that often gets overlooked. For Brentano, inner perception is simply that immediate awareness we have of our own mental processes. It's like an ongoing stream of consciousness. Introspection, on the other hand, implies a kind of detached, objective observation of those processes, and Brentano argues that that's simply not possible.
Right, yeah, it's like trying to catch a fish in your hands. The very act of grabbing it makes it slip away.
Exactly. Think about trying to observe your own anger. The moment you turn your attention to it, the experience itself changes. It becomes something different than it was before you focused on it.
So if introspection is kind of off the table, how can we study the mind empirically? Where do we get our data?
Well, Brentano suggests several alternative avenues. We can observe our behaviors, of course. He also proposes studying autobiographies, delving into the lives of historical figures, and even analyzing historical events to understand the psychological forces at play.
That's interesting. So not just looking at individuals, but also understanding the collective mind of a society or a historical period.
Precisely. And he makes another intriguing point, studying individuals with restored senses.
Oh,
Imagine someone who's been cured of congenital blindness.
okay.
Their experience of sight wouldn't be clouded by years of learned associations.
Mm.
It could offer us a glimpse into those basic building blocks of perception.
That's fascinating, like seeing the world with fresh eyes, literally.
Yes.
Okay, but here's where things get really interesting. Brentano takes on this concept that's been debated for centuries, unconscious mental activity. And he doesn't hold back.
He really doesn't.
So he directly challenges this idea that we can possess knowledge without actively thinking about it.
Right.
We all have tons of information stored in our memory that we're not consciously accessing at any given moment.
Right.
And philosophers like Aquinas, Leibniz, and even Kant believe this pointed to a kind of unconscious consciousness.
They did. It's a pretty common thread.
Yeah.
Huh.
But Brentano isn't buying it.
Nope.
He meticulously dismantles the arguments for unconscious mental processes. He even dissects specific examples used to support the idea.
Right.
One example comes from Ulrichi, who describes seemingly unconscious sensory experiences that are later recalled.
Right, and Brentano masterfully refutes those claims. He questions whether those experiences were truly unconscious or simply forgotten, highlighting the crucial role of attention in how we form and recall memories. His point is that the concept of unconscious mental activity is unnecessary and lacks scientific validity.
Interesting. So if we throw out this idea of unconscious thought, how does Brentano explain our inner experience? He introduces this really important distinction between the act of inner perception and its content.
Yes, this gets to the heart of his theory of consciousness. Brentano argues that every mental act has an object, something it refers to or is directed toward. Even in something as simple as hearing, we can distinguish between the act of hearing and the sound that is heard.
So even in our most basic sensory experiences, there's this fundamental difference between the experiencer and the experience.
Right. Yeah.
It's like we're always reaching out to grasp something, with our minds.
Exactly. And it raises a question, what about when we think about things that don't exist in reality, like a unicorn or a dragon?
Right, yeah. That's where it gets a little mind-bending. Does Brentano say we can only experience things that actually exist?
Well, that's where his concept of intentional inexistence comes in. He says that even imaginary objects have a kind of existence as objects of thought. They might not be real in the physical world, but they still have a reality within our mental realm.
So our minds can create their own objects, even if they don't correspond to anything out there. That's pretty profound.
It is. It challenges our typical assumptions about where reality begins and ends.
Hmm. Okay, on to another big idea, the unity of consciousness.
Okay.
Brentano argues that we experience our mental life as a unified whole,
Hmm.
even though there are multiple processes happening at the same time.
Yes, it's like a symphony orchestra playing a complex piece of music. There are many different instruments, each with its own part, but they all come together to create a single unified experience.
Yeah, that's a great analogy, and it seems to challenge this view of the mind as a collection of separate faculties or compartments.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, Brentano is suggesting a more integrated, dynamic understanding of how our minds work.
Precisely. And this raises a question for you. Do you experience your mental life as unified?
Ooh.
It's something to reflect on.
I'm definitely going to be pondering that one. Okay, let's move on to how Brentano approaches the classification of mental phenomena. He seems to have some issues with the traditional classifications based solely on the source of knowledge, like dividing mental processes into those stemming from the senses versus the intellect.
Right. He argues that such classifications are far too simplistic.
Okay.
They don't capture the true complexity of our mental lives. For example, even something like our experience of colors is far more varied and nuanced than those traditional categories suggest.
Hmm. So what does he propose instead? What's Brentano's alternative way of classifying these mental phenomena?
He offers a groundbreaking classification based on how mental phenomena refer to an object. He identifies three fundamental classes: presentation, judgment, and phenomena of love and hate.
All right, break those down for us. What does each category involve? Give us the Brentano 101.
Well, presentation is simply the act of having something before the mind, whether it's a sensory perception like seeing a tree or hearing a bird, a memory of a past event, or even an imagined object like a unicorn. It's that basic act of experiencing something.
Okay, so presentation is about what's being presented to the mind. What about judgment?
Judgment goes beyond mere presentation. It involves taking a stance on that object. It's about affirming or denying something, believing it to be true or false.
So judgment is about making a decision about the object, deciding whether we agree or disagree with it, whether we accept it or reject it.
Exactly. It adds another layer of complexity to our mental experience.
Okay, and finally there are the phenomena of love and hate.
Wow.
What does that category encompass?
This category includes all those mental states where we take a positive or negative stance toward an object. It includes things like loving, hating, desiring, or rejecting.
So it seems like this category is all about our emotional responses to things, how we feel about the objects we experience.
Precisely. And it highlights the fact that our mental lives are not just about cold, neutral observations. Our emotions, our desires, our aversions all play a crucial role in how we engage with the world.
This classification system is really intriguing. It seems to focus more on the relationship between the mind and its objects, rather than just the content of our thoughts.
That's a great observation, and Brentano really emphasizes this point. He goes to great lengths to demonstrate that judgment is a distinct mental act, not just a more complex combination of presentations.
So he's saying that making a judgment is fundamentally different from simply having an experience.
Mm.
What are the implications of that? Why should we care about this distinction between presentation and judgment?
Well, it's a profound insight because it suggests that our minds are actively constructing our understanding of the world. We're not just passively receiving information, we're constantly making judgments about what's true, what's valuable, what matters to us.
So it's not just about what we experience, but also how we interpret and evaluate those experiences. That makes sense. But if judgment is so different from presentation, why do we so often fall into the trap of seeing them as basically the same thing.
Well, Brentano attributes this to both psychological and linguistic factors.
Okay.
Psychologically, we're always aware of our own mental acts. This constant presence of inner judgment can blur the lines between the act of presentation and the act of judging.
It's like we're so used to making judgments that we don't even notice we're doing it. It becomes almost automatic.
Exactly. And linguistically, the way we talk about our thoughts often reinforces this misconception. You know, we use phrases like, I think that, or I believe that, which can make it seem like judgment is just a more elaborate form of presentation.
Hmm. So it's almost like we're tricked by our own minds and language into oversimplifying the complexity of our thought processes.
Precisely, but Brentano gives us the tools to see through these illusions and grasp the true nature of our mental activity.
This is seriously making me rethink how I understand my own thoughts.
Mm.
Okay, let's talk about the last category, feelings and will. Why does Brentano group them together? What do they have in common that makes them distinct from presentation and judgment?
Well, what's fascinating is that Brentano recognizes a shared characteristic in feelings and acts of will. They both involve taking a stance toward an object, but the stance is rooted in our emotions and desires. It can be positive or negative. Love and hate, desire and aversion all fall under this umbrella.
So it's like our emotions and motivations are also ways of engaging with the world. They're not just random feelings or impulses, but they reflect this underlying structure of how our minds connect with objects.
Exactly. And this insight leads to a connection between this psychological classification and a classic philosophical triad, the beautiful, the true, and the good.
Whoa, hold on. How do we go from psychology to philosophy here? How are these connected?
Well, Brentano suggests that each of these three classes of mental phenomena, presentation, judgment, and feelings, will, has its own kind of perfection. And this perfection manifests itself in the feeling that accompanies every mental act. The most perfect acts within each class, he says, bring about a particular kind of pleasure.
So it's like each way of engaging with the world has its own ultimate experience, its peak state.
Exactly. The highest perfection of presentation, for instance, lies in the contemplation of beauty, whether it's a breathtaking sunset, a masterpiece of art, or even a perfectly crafted piece of music. That experience of beauty arises from a perfectly realized act of presentation.
It's like those moments when you're totally absorbed in something beautiful and time seems to stop and you're just filled with awe and wonder.
Precisely. And Brentano argues that this experience is not just subjective, it reflects an objective quality of the object itself. The beautiful object possesses a certain perfection that elicits this particular kind of pleasure in the observer.
So beauty isn't just in the eye of the beholder, as they say. It's actually a reflection of something real and inherent in the object itself.
That's Brentano's argument, and he extends this idea to the other classes of mental phenomena as well. The highest perfection of judgment, for example, leads to the experience of truth, and the highest perfection of love and hate leads to the experience of the good.
So it's like our minds are wired to seek out these perfections, and when we find them, we experience a deep sense of fulfillment and satisfaction.
Exactly. And this insight can have profound implications for how we live our lives. It suggests that we should cultivate those mental capacities that allow us to experience these perfections more fully.
That's a powerful message. Okay, we've covered so much ground here. Let's take a step back and talk about Brentano's overall goal in writing psychology from an empirical standpoint. What was he trying to achieve with this book?
Well, Brentano had a grand vision. He wanted to establish psychology as a rigorous scientific discipline. He wanted to move the field away from speculative philosophy and ground it in careful observation of mental phenomena. But he wasn't just interested in describing mental processes. He also wanted to understand their underlying structure and how they connect to the world around us.
It sounds like he was building a whole new framework for understanding the human mind, one that was both scientifically sound and philosophically rich.
Exactly. And he does this by challenging many long-held assumptions and introducing a new way of thinking about the fundamental building blocks of our mental lives.
This has been a wild ride, but there's one thing that keeps nagging at me. Why did Brentano insist that the only objects of consciousness are things? What about abstract concepts like justice or infinity? Those don't seem like things in the usual sense.
That's a question that has puzzled many scholars. Brentano argues that even abstract concepts can ultimately be understood as referring to concrete things, although in a more complex and indirect way.
Hmm.
For example, the concept of justice might ultimately refer to the actions of just individuals or the structure of a just society.
So it's like even our most abstract ideas are ultimately grounded in the concrete reality of things in the world.
That's the essence of Brentano's argument, and it has significant implications for how we understand the relationship between our minds and the world. It suggests that our thoughts are not simply floating in some abstract realm. They're anchored in the reality of things.
This is really making me rethink everything I thought I knew about thinking. Okay,
Yeah.
one more question before we wrap up. Brentano originally planned to write 6 books,
He did, yes.
but we only have 2. What happened to the other 4?
That's a bit of a mystery. Brentano himself offers some clues in the preface to the English edition. He mentions that he continued to explore the topics he had planned for the remaining books in various monographs and lecture courses, but for reasons unknown, those later works never reached the same level of completion or systematic development as the first 2 books.
It's like there's a whole other half of Brentano's psychological theory that's lost to history. What a shame.
Perhaps, but even with just these 2 books, Brentano offers a wealth of insights that continue to influence psychological thought today. And who knows, maybe someday those lost manuscripts will resurface and reveal even more of Brentano's brilliant mind.
That would be incredible. Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Psychology from an empirical standpoint isn't exactly a light read.
It's not.
What advice would you give to someone trying to tackle this book for the first time? It can be quite dense and challenging.
You're absolutely right. It's not a book you can just skim through. Brentano was incredibly meticulous in his arguments. He builds them step by step through a process of elimination and logical deduction. I would encourage readers to take their time, focus on one section at a time, and maybe even make notes as they go along.
So it's a book that requires active reading and engagement.
Absolutely. It's a rewarding read, but it demands your full attention. And it can also be helpful to read some secondary sources that provide context and explain some of Brentano's more challenging ideas. There are some excellent commentaries out there that can really illuminate his thinking.
That's great advice.
Yeah.
And speaking of challenging ideas, Brentano introduces a lot of new terminology, which can be a bit intimidating for the uninitiated. What are some key terms that are essential to grasp in order to understand his theory?
Well, intentional in existence is a big one.
Yeah.
It's a mouthful, but it's crucial for understanding how Brentano accounts for our ability to think about things that don't actually exist. Another important term is immanent objectivity, which refers to the way the objects of thought exist within the mind.
So the object itself doesn't have to exist in the real world for us to have an experience of it. It just needs to have a kind of reality within our mental space.
Exactly. And this distinction is central to Brentano's overall project of establishing a rigorous empirical psychology. He's trying to show that we can study the mind scientifically by focusing on these immanent objects of thought.
This is all starting to click into place. Okay, let's talk about Brentano's legacy. How did his work influence later developments in psychology?
Well, Brentano's influence is far-reaching. He's considered one of the founders of phenomenology, a school of thought that emphasizes the careful description of subjective experience.
So it's like he provided the foundation for a whole new way of approaching the study of consciousness.
Exactly. And his work continues to be relevant today, especially in areas like cognitive science and the philosophy of mind.
That's amazing to think about. Okay, let's zoom in a bit and delve into some of the specific examples that Brentano uses to illustrate his arguments. What are some particularly memorable or thought-provoking examples that stood out to you?
One that comes to mind is his analysis of how we experience time. He challenges the common sense notion that time is a kind of container that things move through. Instead, he argues that our experience of time is based on the relationships between different mental acts.
Can you unpack that a bit? I'm having trouble wrapping my head around that one.
Sure. For instance, when we say that something happened in the past, we're not referring to some objective past moment. Instead, we're expressing a relationship between a present act of remembering and the past event that we're remembering.
So it's like our sense of the past is constructed through our present acts
Mhm.
of remembering.
Precisely. And this has profound implications for how we understand memory and the nature of time itself.
It's it's almost like our minds are constantly creating time as we experience it. That's a mind-blowing idea.
It is. And this example beautifully illustrates Brentano's ability to challenge fundamental assumptions and offer a new perspective on seemingly familiar aspects of our experience.
Okay, last question for this part. This whole deep dive has been incredibly insightful. But I'd be remiss if we didn't touch on any criticisms or limitations of Brentano's theory.
Right.
Are there any potential weaknesses or blind spots we should be aware of?
Well, one common criticism is that Brentano's intense focus on consciousness might lead to neglecting the role of unconscious processes. After all, there's a lot happening beneath the surface that shapes our thoughts and behaviors.
So some might argue that he goes too far in rejecting the idea of unconscious mental activity altogether, that maybe there's a middle ground.
Yeah, that's a valid point. There's definitely a lively debate among scholars about whether Brentano's theory can fully account for the complexities of human behavior without incorporating some notion of the unconscious.
It seems like there's always more to explore and discover when it comes to the mind. But even with these criticisms, Brentano's work is undeniably a cornerstone of modern psychology.
Mm.
His ideas continue to offer us profound insights into the nature of consciousness.
Absolutely. And one of the things that makes his work so compelling is that it's not just about dry academic theories. He grapples with fundamental questions about what it means to be human.
He's trying to understand the very essence of our experience. That's what makes this deep dive so fascinating. It's not just about psychology, it's about understanding ourselves.
Mhm.
And one of his most radical claims is that all objects of thought, even abstract concepts, are ultimately things. That can be a real head scratcher.
It can be.
How can something like justice or infinity be a thing?
Right. But that's the beauty of engaging with Brentano. He forces us to think deeper, to question our assumptions, and to expand our understanding of what's possible.
He reminds us that psychology is a living, breathing field of study, and there's always more to learn.
Always.
So to our listener out there, we encourage you to take the plunge and explore Brentano's work for yourself.
You might be surprised by what you discover, not just about the human mind, but about the world itself. After all, Brentano was a true pioneer. Oh,
Yeah.
always seeking truth, always challenging conventional wisdom. So follow your curiosity and see where it leads you.
What a great way to put it. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the mind of Franz Brentano. We'll see you next time for another adventure in the world of ideas.